Welcome back everybody to Mrs. Chad Daniels' Very Rich Fruitcake tutorial. This is part 3 of making a very rich fruitcake, and as you can see I've got some alcohol here ready to feed the cake. So this week's offering for everybody to watch is literally what to do next once you've made the cake. So if I move the alcohol out of the way for a minute and show you this beautiful specimen that has been, since it was cooked and allowed to cool down in the oven after it had been cooking for about 3 hours, you've got this beautiful, very rich fruitcake. The smell from this is absolutely wonderful because obviously you've got the alcohol that was in the fruit that has now sort of gone percolated through the cake, and it's really lovely. Now, to feed a cake, you need to do this if you want to. You don't have to, but you need to do it at least once before you actually put the marzipan on the top. So to do it, I'm going to take my cake off the grease proof that it's been sat inside for a week, and I've got a chopping board underneath it. There we go. So it's quite sturdy. It's quite a large cake, this. Okay, and what you traditionally do is you take some kind of cake tester. You can use a very fine knife, but be very careful that you don't overcut the cake because you don't want it to disintegrate. But with one of these cake testers, there's a very, very fine metal skewer. If you just basically take the skewer every few centimeters, go right down to the bottom of the cake until you hit the board. And you can do this all over the cake. If you find that you've got a shiny top on the cake, some people, what they do is they turn the cake over, and they do this from the bottom, if you like, the bottom of the cake, to absorb. What you're creating here is some holes for the alcohol to actually travel down through. So that's what I'm doing. I'm going all over, and I'm going right down to the bottom to create some little channels for the alcohol to go over. Okay. Now what you can do then is literally take a little bit, and I've only got a couple of 2 or 3 tablespoons of sherry left in here, and I can just literally just dribble a tiny little bit where I can see a hole. There you go, and just let it percolate down inside the cake. Now this is helping to prepare and preserve the cake and give it a little bit more alcohol. If you've soaked your cake in, your fruit for the cake in a lot of alcohol, there's no need to do this step, but it does add another layer of moistness to the cake. There we go. And it might be that you just use 2 or 3 tablespoons of alcohol, and you just do this once a week for 2 or 3 weeks. And that's traditionally what happened, is you literally did this once a week for 3 weeks. And we're still in November. We're only in the middle of November at the moment. So you could do this 2 or 3 weeks and say to yourself, yeah, but first week in December, I'll start marzipaning. But once a week until then, I'm going to just feed the cake to give it that little extra hit of alcohol and keep it nice and moist. Keep the alcohol content up so that it's really delicious to eat, nice and moist. And you could do that yourself. So that's all I'm going to put on. It's literally two tablespoons today. And then what you would do is you take your greaseproof paper and wrap it up. And it's very important that you keep it wrapped securely so that no insects and things can get into it. If you've got a very large tin that you can put it in that's airtight, that's great. And keep it in a cool, dry cupboard. Don't put it anywhere warm that it might sweat, because you can actually have the cake go moldy if you do that. So nice and cool. Doesn't need to be cold, but cool certainly, free of moisture, and closed, and secure it up so that nothing can get to it. Now, as well as feeding the cake, and you can do this bit that I'm going to show you now either before or after you feed it, it doesn't matter. Okay, think to yourself, right, how much marzipan am I going to put on this cake next? Because that's going to be the next step. And next week, I'm actually going to show you the art of marzipaning and show you some techniques. It doesn't matter what the top of the cake, you can see that it's a little bit uneven. We've got a few sort of peaks around here. We've got a little bit of a dent in the middle there. We've got obviously the corners and the edges are a little bit lower. And in the past, some people have said, well, shouldn't you sort of slice the top part of the cake off? No, don't do that. I'm going to show you a trick next week about how to actually maximize the amount of cake that you've got. Okay. Now, when I make these cakes every year, I actually make one to divide into 4. So that's one of the jobs I'm going to do now, because these 4 quarters of the cake are actually going to become presents that I give to friends of mine that I've had for many years that particularly love fruit cake. So I'm going to slice this one huge cake in half to start with. You probably won't do this. You'll make one cake that you'll decorate. And there you go. I think that is about halfway there. There we are. And I'm cutting it into 4 quarters like so. And it doesn't matter if they're not even, they're going to get some cake in the middle. And I'm going to now show you what to do, or how to calculate how much icing and marzipan you're going to need for your cake. Obviously, if this was one big cake, you'd weigh the whole thing. But I'm going to move that out of the way for a second. And I'm going to get my weighing scale out, turn it on. When it says 0, in fact, I'll do it so that you can see the actual display there. There you are. I'm going to take 1 quarter of my lovely cake. I can show you what it looks like on the inside. Look at that beautiful cake there. I'm going to put it on top of the scales there, and it says it's just under 800 grams there. Now, how much marzipan do you need to cover an 800 gram cake? Well, what's half of 800? 400. So I will need 400 grams of marzipan to cover an 800 gram cake. All right, and that's it. You just literally weigh the cake and halve that weight. That's how much marzipan to use. That will give you about 3/4 of a centimetre, or in old money, quarter of an inch, at least 1/4 of an inch of marzipan thickness all the way around. It will also give you extra, and you can decide how thin you want to do the marzipaning, which we'll talk about and I'll show you next week. But that's what I need to think about, is each of my cakes, each of my quarter is going to require 400 grams of marzipan. So now that I've done that, I can move that off. It also will require 400 grams of icing. So let's talk about the things that you'll need to get ready. And I recommend you do this as early as possible, because, supplies do run out in shops. So even if you don't intend to marzipan and ice yet, and buy boards like this, I would stock them up. Okay, so first of all, you're going to need a cake board. Traditionally, if you've made a round cake, buy a round board. A square cake, like the ones that I've got here. And if you think that you're going to have about, a good 1/2 centimetre of marzipan, and you're going to have a good 1/2 centimetre of icing as well, sort of add a couple of centimetres in terms of size, and then think, yes, you want the silver board rim to show as well. So try and buy a board that, as you can see with the one I've got here, is at least 5 centimetres, if not 6 centimetres bigger, all the way around the cake. And that's going to be a nice sort of presentation for your cake. So get yourself a board. It doesn't have to be one of the deep boards. Just one of these nice thin boards is good enough. Okay, you don't need that until you start marzipaning. But as I said earlier, I would recommend getting supplies in because they do tend to run out once people start to make Christmas cakes. Okay, so what else? So here we've got marzipan. You can buy the golden or the white marzipan. There are recipes online to how to make marzipan. I like the yellow contrast to the white icing and the dark cake inside, but it's up to you. And this block here is in fact 454 grams, an old-fashioned pound of marzipan. So you know that's all I need. One of those. That's a little bit more than 400, but just one pack of marzipan will cover one of these cakes. Okay, so you decide how thick you want your marzipan, and I'll show you how to do that next week. But as well as marzipan, don't forget the traditional glue that you stick the marzipan to the cake with is apricot jam. So make sure you've got a little bit of jam. You don't have to use apricot, but it's obviously the yellow colour of the marzipan. So that it doesn't sort of contrast, but you don't have to. You can use pineapple jam, you can use strawberry jam if you've got nothing else. Okay, any kind of jam. Jam is what glues marzipan to the cake. Okay, after that you're going to need icing. Now, think now before you even start marzipaning, think what you want your cake to look like. Who are you making the cake for? If you've got elderly relatives who like softer icing, it might be that you want to buy some fondant icing. This is fondant icing by Sainsbury's. And again, I'll need 400 grams for the cake that I've got here in front of me. And this is 1 kilogram. So this one box to actually ice a marzipan cake this big will actually do 2 cakes. And that will give you about 0.5 centimetre thickness. If you like it thicker, obviously use more. But get those supplies in as well. Now, to stick icing to marzipan, you just use egg white. And most people have got an egg in the house. So that's what sticks that in. But don't forget, you're going to be rolling everything out if you're using fondant icing, and you're going to be using icing sugar. Instead of flour, you wouldn't use flour in this, but icing sugar is what stops or prevents the marzipan and the icing sticking to the table when you're doing it. So get in a box of icing sugar if you're going to be using fondant icing and marzipan. But also, if it might be that you prefer royal icing, which is the kind of icing that goes hard, in which case you can either buy boxes of royal icing or make your own with icing sugar, lemon juice and egg white, and I'm going to be showing you that in a few weeks' time, how to ice and fondant ice the cakes. Okay, so think about your designs at this point and think, what am I actually going to make this into? Am I going to make this into just a little snow scene? Am I going to make it into an object? I had a friend at school once who actually said, I've got a square cake. I'm going to make it into a little square house with Santa on the top and put a chimney in the middle and make it look like the top of a little house. So think about your design and think ahead and think, what kind of thickness of marzipan and icing, etc., do I want to put on? So here is my cake, which I'm going to move back onto the board. I'm going to put that out of the way because I don't need it this week. And all I'm going to do is wrap them up in the greaseproof paper. So literally 1/4 at a time. And I'm going to wrap it up nice and tightly. There we go. Like a parcel. Tuck it underneath. And that's going to stay in my cool, dry cupboard with all the other 3 until next week when I'm going to marzipan them. As I say, if you want to feed your cake 2 or 3 times over 2 or 3 weeks, you would have to unwrap it and just pour the sherry or brandy or whatever over through the holes. You don't need to put any more holes in because they're there now forever. And do that 2 or 3 times until you need to marzipan. Once you start marzipaning and icing, you don't do any more feeding. Okay, so that's it for this week's sort of offering. It's more of a preparation and getting yourself organised and thinking ahead. And don't forget, get your supplies in early. See you next week.